As she zipped up her suitcase and reached for the door, Linda didn't hesitate. She didn't cry. She didn't even look back. 40 years of marriage shattered. And the man she once trusted? He was about to learn what true loss felt like. Linda had been busy all afternoon. She set the table, decorated the living room with balloons, and made sure the kids were entertained. The house felt full of energy, but in the back of her mind, a quiet tension had been growing. It wasn't the party or the kids, it was Frank, her husband of nearly 40 years. Today he seemed different. She noticed him more than usual, but not in the way she once did. It wasn't the way he laughed at jokes or the way he looked at her when they'd share a quiet moment. No, this was different. His eyes kept darting toward one woman, a woman Linda didn't recognize. Maggie. She stood by the punch bowl, chatting with a few relatives, but every now and then she'd glance over at Frank. Linda wasn't sure if it was her imagination or something more, but the way Frank reacted to Maggie's glances, it wasn't right. Linda tried to ignore it. She focused on serving cake to the kids, making small talk with the guests, but something about Maggie's presence unsettled her. Every time she looked over, Frank was too close to her, talking to her quietly, laughing, touching her arm. Linda felt a knot tighten in her stomach. At one point, Linda stepped outside for some fresh air. Her mind was spinning. She had been suspicious for a while now, but today it felt different. Frank was acting like he had something to hide. She thought back to the last few months, the late nights at the office, the unexplained calls, the trips he took without her. Was this what it had been all along? Was she just blind to it? She couldn't ignore it any longer. Maggie's presence had confirmed it. The affair wasn't just a thought in her mind anymore. It was real. Linda wasn't sure how long it had been going on, but the signs were clear. Frank had been seeing someone else, and now that she knew, the question wasn't if he'd admit it. It was when. The party was in full swing, but Linda couldn't be part of it anymore. She had seen enough. As the laughter and chatter continued in the background, Linda quietly made her way to the hallway, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. She found Frank standing by the stairs, sipping a drink, looking out of place in the middle of all the celebration. He looked up, surprised to see her. "What's wrong?" Frank asked, his tone almost defensive. Linda didn't answer right away. She studied him for a moment. His face was tired, but there was something else there, something familiar. The same look he had when he was trying to hide something he'd hidden from her for months. "I know," she said, her voice steady but cold. "I know about you and Maggie." Frank froze. His face drained of color. He put the drink down quickly, as if trying to act like it didn't matter. "Linda, please, it's not what you think," he started, but she interrupted him. "Oh, it's exactly what I think," she replied, cutting him off. "I've seen the way you've been acting. The late nights, the phone calls, and now her here at our grandson's birthday party. What the hell is going on, Frank?" He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Linda stood firm, her eyes locked onto his. She wasn't angry, not yet, but the hurt was there. She'd spent too many years looking the other way, ignoring the little things that didn't add up. But not now, not anymore. "I'm not stupid, Frank," she said, her voice quieter now. "I saw the way you looked at her. I saw how she looked at you. This wasn't some one-time thing, was it?" He swallowed hard, unable to meet her eyes. "Linda, it's over," he finally said, his voice shaking. "It was a mistake. It ended months ago. Please, you have to believe me." Linda took a step closer, the silence between them thickening. She didn't need him to apologize. She didn't need him to tell her it was over. She knew it wasn't just the affair that hurt. It was the lies. The years of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. "You don't get to just say it's over, Frank," Linda said. "You don't get to walk back into my life after all of this and expect everything to be fine." Frank's face was pale now, his eyes filled with regret. He took a shaky breath, and for the first time, he looked like he was about to confess everything. I don't know how to fix this, Linda. I don't know if you can ever forgive me, but I'll do anything. Please, just—" She didn't let him finish. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She needed to hear it, needed him to say the words that had been hanging in the air for so long. Frank's eyes dropped. He couldn't meet her gaze. "A year," he muttered. Linda stepped back, the words hitting her harder than she expected. A year. He had been seeing Maggie for a year, lying to her face every day. All the years they'd spent together, all the moments they'd shared. Had it all meant so little to him? "A year," Linda repeated, the weight of it sinking in. "You've been lying to me for a year." Frank nodded, his face contorted in guilt. "I'm sorry, Linda. I swear it was a mistake. I never meant for it to go this far. I never meant to hurt you." Linda stared at him for a long moment, her mind racing. She could feel the anger starting to rise, but she kept it in check. She couldn't let him see her crumble. Not yet. Not when she still had a decision to make. She wasn't sure what hurt more, the affair or the years of quiet betrayals. She'd thought their marriage was solid, that they were partners, but Frank had built his own world, one where she didn't belong. And now, it was up to her to decide whether she could ever find a way back to the life they'd built, or if it was time to leave it all behind. Her eyes finally met his, and she spoke the words he had been dreading. "I'm done listening to your excuses, Frank. I need space." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, realizing that the life he knew was slipping through his fingers. Linda walked away, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. Her hands were shaking, though she refused to let them show it. She had been married to Frank for almost 40 years, shared a home, children, grandchildren. And for an entire year, he had been sneaking around with another woman, a woman she had only just met today. The betrayal wasn't just about the affair, it was about the months of deception. She stepped into the kitchen, taking a slow breath as she poured herself a glass of water. The sounds of the party felt distant now, muffled, as if they were happening in another world. She could hear Frank's footsteps behind her, hesitant. He had followed her. "Linda, please, just hear me out," he said, voice low, almost desperate. She turned to face him, leaning against the counter, her arms crossed. "You had a year to tell me, Frank, a whole damn year, and now you want to talk." Frank swallowed hard. His hands rested on the back of a chair, as if he needed something to hold on to. "It wasn't like that. I swear, I didn't plan for it to happen." Linda let out a bitter laugh. "You didn't plan to cheat on me. That's your excuse." "I was lonely," Frank admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. We weren't the same anymore, Linda. We barely talked. I felt like I was just existing in this house, like we were just two people living side by side. And then Maggie, she just showed up again, out of nowhere. It was easy to talk to her. She reminded me of— "Don't," Linda cut him off, her voice sharp. "Don't you dare say she reminded you of something good, not when you spent a year lying to me." Frank sighed, rubbing his face with his hands. He looked tired, worn out, like the weight of his choices had finally crashed down on him. But Linda wasn't interested in his guilt. She had spent too many years making excuses for his behavior, too many years brushing off the small hurts. Not this time. Then, just when she thought she had heard it all, Frank spoke again. "There's something else," he said hesitantly. "You need to know the truth." Linda narrowed her eyes. "What truth?" Frank hesitated. He looked like he wanted to take the words back before he even said them. Then finally he spoke. Maggie wasn't just an old classmate, Linda. She was my first love. The glass in Linda's hand nearly slipped. She tightened her grip, feeling her pulse spike. "What?" she whispered. Frank nodded, guilt all over his face. "We dated before I met you, before I even thought about settling down. And when she came back into my life, it felt familiar, like something unfinished." Linda felt like the ground had just shifted beneath her feet. This wasn't just an affair. This wasn't just some midlife mistake Frank had stumbled into. He had reconnected with someone who had once meant something to him, someone he had cared for before she ever existed in his life. That changed everything. Linda stared at Frank, her heart pounding in her chest. So, this was it. The final piece of the puzzle. This wasn't just about lust, boredom, or a meaningless fling. It was about something deeper, something Frank had never let go of. "So what?" Linda asked, her voice eerily calm. "You just picked up where you left off? Decided our marriage wasn't enough because some woman from your past reappeared?" Frank shook his head quickly. "No, Linda, it wasn't like that. I love you. I never stopped loving you." Linda let out a slow breath, staring at him, unblinking. "But you loved her too." Frank opened his mouth, then closed it. And that was all the answer she needed. She felt her throat tighten, but she refused to break in front of him. Her mind raced back over the years, the arguments, the quiet moments, the times he had pulled away, and she had assumed it was just life, just stress, just aging. But now she had to wonder, had Maggie always been in the back of his mind? Had she ever truly had all of him? She felt sick. "You should have told me," she said, her voice shaking. "You should have let me go instead of making me live a lie." Frank reached for her, but she stepped back sharply, the movement so quick and instinctive it made him freeze. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said, his voice thick with regret. "But you did," Linda shot back. "And what's worse, you did it with someone who actually meant something to you. Do you know what that feels like? To know that I was second choice when I was supposed to be your wife." Frank ran a hand over his face, his own emotions catching up with him. "I swear, I ended it, Linda. She wanted more, but I told her no. I knew it was wrong. That's why I ended it months ago." Linda let out a sharp laugh. "Months ago? Frank, do you think that makes a damn difference to me? What, you get credit for breaking off the affair you never should have had in the first place?" She shook her head, stepping back toward the doorway. She couldn't stand there, in that kitchen, with him any longer. The man she had built her life with suddenly felt like a stranger. "I don't even know who you are anymore," she whispered. Frank took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. "Linda, please, just tell me what you want me to do." She met his eyes, and for the first time, she saw true fear in them. Not fear of losing her, but fear of finally facing the consequences of everything he had done. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I need time, and I need space, and right now, Frank, I don't want to look at you." Without another word, she walked out, leaving Frank standing there alone, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. Linda stepped outside, the cool evening air hitting her face like a slap. The party was still going, laughter and music spilling from the house, but it all felt distant, like she was watching it happen through a glass window. She gripped the porch railing, steadying herself. Her whole body felt numb. Frank had been in love with Maggie once, maybe still was, and for an entire year he had betrayed her with a woman who wasn't just some passing fling, but someone who had been part of his past, someone who had always lingered in the shadows of his mind. Linda didn't know what stung more, the affair itself, or the realization that she had spent decades in a marriage where she was never truly his first choice. She heard the door creak behind her. A part of her knew it would be Frank. He wouldn't let her just walk away without trying to fix what he had already shattered. "Linda." His voice was low, cautious. "Please don't shut me out." She turned slowly, her face unreadable. "Shut you out," she repeated. "You've already been gone for a year, Frank. I just didn't know it." His shoulders slumped. He looked older now, smaller somehow. "It didn't mean I didn't love you," he said, voice raw. "I made a mistake, but it wasn't because I stopped loving you." Linda shook her head, her breath sharp. "Stop saying it was a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. Every text, every visit, every lie you told me, you chose it, and I was the fool who trusted you." Frank exhaled heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. "I don't want to lose you, Linda." She let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Funny," she said. "You didn't seem too worried about that when you were with her." Silence stretched between them. Frank looked down, ashamed. Linda studied him, feeling nothing but exhaustion. How many years had she spent holding this marriage together? How many times had she told herself that love was about patience, about compromise? Maybe love was also about knowing when to stop trying. She turned back toward the house, her voice steady. "I need to think." Frank nodded slowly, as if he knew there was nothing else he could say. He stepped back, letting her go. Linda walked inside, past the guests who had no idea that her world had just cracked open. Past her children, her grandchildren, all of them caught up in the joy of the night. For the first time, she realized she had been living in a story she hadn't written. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to keep reading. Later that night, after the guests had left and the house was quiet, Linda sat in the dimly lit living room. She held a glass of wine in her hand, staring blankly at the coffee table. The silence felt too loud, pressing in on her. Frank had gone to bed, alone. He hadn't tried to push her into talking again, which was smart. She wasn't ready. Maybe she never would be. Her phone buzzed on the table. She frowned, picking it up. A message from an unknown number. "Linda, I think we should talk." She stared at the screen, her heart pounding. She didn't recognize the number, but something deep inside told her exactly who it was. Maggie. Linda's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Why the hell was she reaching out now? What could she possibly have to say? Apologies, explanations, some pathetic attempt to justify what she had done. Linda's first instinct was to delete the message, block the number, pretend she never saw it. But then a thought crept in, slow and unsettling. What if there was something Frank hadn't told her? Her breath caught. She had gotten the confession out of him, yes, but had he told her everything? Or just enough to make himself look better? She tapped the screen, her response brief. "Say whatever you need to say." Seconds later, the reply came. "Meet me tomorrow. There's something you don't know." Linda's hands tightened around the phone. Her pulse was a drum in her ears. She had thought she knew the whole story, but maybe she had only scratched the surface. Linda barely slept that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the past day. The confession, the betrayal, the message. What else could there be? Hadn't she already heard enough? By morning, her decision was made. She needed to meet Maggie. Not for closure. Linda didn't believe in that nonsense. But for the truth, the whole truth. Because after a year of lies, she wasn't about to take Frank's word for anything. She arrived at the cafe 10 minutes early, choosing a table near the window. It was a quiet place, the kind of spot where people met for polite conversation. But nothing about this was polite. Linda's hands rested on the table, steady, but her stomach was twisted into knots. The door opened, and there she was, Maggie. She was thinner than Linda had expected, short, with dark hair and tired eyes. Not some young thing, not glamorous or flashy, just normal. And maybe that was what made it worse. Maggie spotted her, hesitated, then walked over. "Linda," she said softly. Linda didn't stand. She just gestured to the seat across from her. "Sit." Maggie obeyed. A waitress came over, but neither of them ordered. The air was too thick, too charged. "I don't know why you wanted to meet," Linda said, keeping her voice even. "Frank already told me what happened. A year-long affair, some nonsense about unfinished feelings. I don't need your version of the same lie." Maggie exhaled, folding her hands on the table. "I didn't ask you here to justify myself," she said. "I asked you here because Frank didn't tell you everything." Linda narrowed her eyes. "What didn't he tell me?" Maggie hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. Then she leaned in slightly, her voice low. "He was never going to leave you, Linda. I knew that. I never asked him to. But I ended it months ago because I found out something that changed everything." Linda didn't move, didn't blink. "And what was that?" Maggie swallowed hard. "I wasn't the only one." The words hit like a slap. Linda's grip tightened around the edge of the table. "What?" Maggie's face was full of regret, but Linda didn't care. "I thought I was the only one," Maggie continued. "He made me believe that, but then I found messages, another woman, someone younger. I confronted him about it and he brushed it off. That's when I realized this wasn't some tragic love story between us. I was just another distraction for him." Linda felt something cold settle in her chest. She had come here thinking she already knew the worst, but the worst kept getting worse. "You're lying," Linda said, but even she didn't believe the words. Maggie shook her head. "I wish I was, but I have proof." She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and slid it across the table. Linda hesitated, then picked it up. Her fingers scrolled through messages, ones that weren't from Maggie, but from someone else. Different name, same pattern, sweet words, hidden meetings, the same damn lies. Her husband had been lying to her for a year, but he had also been lying to Maggie, and God knows who else. Linda slowly set the phone down, her breath steady but sharp. She looked up at Maggie, but she wasn't really seeing her anymore. She was seeing Frank. Frank, who had sat in their kitchen last night pretending to be ashamed, pretending to be sorry, pretending. Maggie sighed. "I know you probably hate me, and I don't blame you, but I couldn't let you go on believing it was just me. You deserve to know." Linda stood, suddenly needing to be anywhere but here. She didn't care about Maggie, didn't care about anything except the next move she was going to make. She had come for the truth, and now she had it. It was time for Frank to face what he had done. Linda drove home in silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The weight of Maggie's words sat heavy in her chest, pressing down with each passing second. Frank hadn't just betrayed her with one woman. He had been playing the role of a devoted husband while juggling God knows how many lies. And last night, sitting in their kitchen, acting like he was broken, acting like Maggie had been a mistake, he had still been lying. She pulled into the driveway, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment. Her mind was eerily clear now. No more confusion, no more indecision. This was over. She walked into the house, her footsteps sharp against the wooden floor. Frank was sitting at the dining table, newspaper open, coffee in hand like it was just another normal morning. He looked up when he heard her, his face immediately cautious. "Linda," he said carefully. She threw Maggie's phone onto the table. It skidded across the surface, stopping just in front of him. "Go ahead," she said flatly. "Take a look." Frank stared at the phone, then back at her. "What is this?" Linda folded her arms. Messages. From another woman. Not Maggie. Someone else. Do you want to tell me how many more are out there, Frank? Or should I start looking for them myself? His face drained of color. She watched as his fingers twitched, as if debating whether to pick up the phone. But he didn't. He didn't have to. His silence told her everything. Linda let out a slow, bitter breath. You stood there last night, looking me in the eye, telling me it was over, that it was just Maggie, that it was a mistake, and the whole time you knew this was bigger than that. Frank rubbed a hand over his face, exhaling shakily. Linda, please. Don't, she snapped. Don't say my name like that. Don't you dare try to pull me back in with that pathetic voice. I've been your wife for nearly 40 years. I've given you everything. And this is what you do? Sneak around like some pathetic old man who can't handle the life he built? His jaw clenched. It wasn't like that. She slammed her hand against the table. Then tell me what the hell it was like, Frank. Tell me why you spent a year making me look like a fool. Tell me why I should believe a single damn word that comes out of your mouth. He had no answer. He just sat there, hands clasped, his face a mixture of shame and defeat. Linda shook her head, her voice quieter now. You weren't just unfaithful, Frank. You were a coward. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed our family, our home, every moment we ever had that meant something. And you were never going to tell me the truth, were you? You were going to keep lying until you got caught. Frank swallowed hard, finally looking at her. I don't know what to say. She let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. You don't get to say anything, Frank. Not anymore. For the first time in a long time, she felt something lift off her shoulders. The uncertainty, the fear, the part of her that had still wanted to believe he could be the man she thought he was. It was gone. She turned, walking toward the stairs. Where are you going? Frank asked, his voice cracking. Linda paused at the base of the steps, then looked over her shoulder. Her expression was unreadable. I don't know yet, she said. But I do know one thing. Frank waited, his breath held. I'm done being your wife. And with that, she walked away. Linda closed the bedroom door behind her, locking it. She leaned against it for a moment, taking a deep breath. Her hands trembled, but not from sadness, not from heartbreak. It was something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Clarity. She wasn't confused anymore. She wasn't stuck in that painful loop of asking why or how Frank could do this to her. She knew who he was now, a liar, a selfish, weak man who had never valued her the way she had valued him. The bedroom felt unfamiliar as she looked around. This had been their space, their sanctuary. Now it was just a room filled with memories that no longer held warmth. She walked to the closet, yanking open the doors. Her suitcases were on the top shelf, untouched for years. She pulled one down, dust falling around her, and flipped it open on the bed. She wasn't leaving forever, at least not yet. But she couldn't stay here tonight, not in this house, with him. As she packed, she heard a knock at the door. Linda! Frank's voice was hesitant. Can we just talk? She zipped the suitcase hard. No. Linda, please, he said. Don't do this like this. She let out a breath, shaking her head. He still didn't get it. She opened the door, just enough to see his face. He looked desperate, like a man who suddenly realized what he had lost. But Linda wasn't going to be manipulated by that look ever again. I have to do this, Frank, she said, because if I don't, I'll keep letting you steal pieces of me, and I'm done with that. Frank's eyes filled with something she hadn't seen in years. Not sadness, not guilt, fear. For the first time, he truly believed she was going to leave. She stepped back, closing the door in his face. A part of her knew this wasn't the end. There would be more conversations, more fallout, more decisions to make. But for the first time in a long time, she felt in control. She had spent years holding their marriage together. Now she was finally letting go. Linda wheeled her suitcase to the front door, her heart pounding steadily in her chest. She could hear Frank pacing behind her, his breath uneven, his mind scrambling for something, anything, to say that would make her stop. But there was nothing left to say. She reached for the doorknob, but his voice stopped her. "Where are you going?" Linda turned to face him. He stood a few feet away, his hands on his hips, his face worn with regret and panic. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I know I can't stay here." Frank shook his head, stepping closer. "Linda, we built this life together. You can't just—" She raised a hand, silencing him. "You broke this life, Frank, not me." He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "I don't know how to fix this." "You can't," she said simply. And that was the truth of it. There was no fixing something so broken, no undoing what had been done, no taking back the nights he had spent with other women, the lies, the years of deceit. She would never unknow what she knew now. For decades, she had been his wife, his partner, his constant. And yet, in return, he had treated her like an afterthought, a background figure in his life, while he chased distractions. Not anymore. She turned back to the door, pulling it open. The evening air was cool against her skin, crisp and refreshing, like she was stepping into something new, something unknown, yes, but also something hers. She took one step out, then paused. Without turning around, she spoke one last time. "You asked me what I wanted, Frank." She exhaled, her voice steady. "I want to want myself more than I ever wanted this marriage." And with that, she walked away, suitcase rolling behind her. She didn't look back. This story teaches a powerful lesson. Never lose yourself in someone else's choices. Linda spent decades in a marriage believing in loyalty, love, and commitment. But love isn't just about staying. It's about being valued, respected, and chosen every single day. Betrayal isn't just about cheating. It's about dishonesty, broken trust, and emotional neglect. Frank didn't just have an affair. He took Linda's trust for granted. Forgiveness is a choice, but so is walking away. Linda didn't stay out of fear or obligation. She chose herself, proving that age, time, and history don't mean you have to accept betrayal. Respect yourself enough to leave when someone treats you like an option. Linda realized she had spent years giving love to someone who didn't deserve it. The moment she walked away, she reclaimed her power. No matter how long you've been with someone, your happiness and self-respect matter. If someone repeatedly lies to you, betrays you, and makes you feel small, you don't owe them your loyalty. You owe yourself the chance to be free.